The Anglo-Saxon king Alfred of Wessex, pursuing the unification of England, included within his law code a decree based on the treatment of sorcery in Exodus 22:18.
The laws of King Alfred. 30. The women who are wont to receive enchanters and workers of phantasms and witches, suffer thou not to live. The laws of Alfred, Guthrum, and Edward the Elder, of witches, diviners, perjurers, etc. 11. If witches or diviners, perjurers or morth workers, murderers, or foul, defiled, notorious adulteresses be found anywhere within the land, let them be driven from the country and the people cleansed, or let them totally perish within the country, unless they desist, and the more deeply make amends.
Medieval Catholics, like the Romans, occasionally faced an unprecedented challenge to their self-appointed patriarchy, not to mention their manhood, during the conflicts that raged between France and England from 1337 to 1453, a period of attrition so relentless it earned the notorious title of the 100 Years' War. By now, the Vestal institution was replaced with a mere will-o'-the-wisp of an idea, an icon to the immaculate motherhood of Christ. The eternal fires of pagan Delphi and Vesta were by now a flickering candle in the draughty chapels of Christendom, that is, until Joan of Arc upset the natural order. The teenage French peasant embodied the ferocity of Boudica, the prophetic powers of the Pythia, and the sanctity of the Virgin Mary, all rolled into a variation of the Holy Trinity. No guesses where she ended up. The fires were burning once again, except this time the Virgin was in it. It took another half a millennium of Catholic soul-searching to canonize the most troublesome witch of them all in 1920, just around the time the women's suffrage movement was gaining traction in the West. Sorcery simply couldn't be ignored by the authorities at the highest level, any authorities it seemed, Catholic or otherwise, and was still deemed serious enough to be treated as a felony under the reign of King Henry VIII, who, having taken responsibility away from the Catholic Church, introduced the Witchcraft Act of 1542.
The bill against conjurations and witchcrafts and sorcery and enchantments, where divers and sundry persons unlawfully have used, devised, practiced or exercised any invocations or conjurations of spirits, witchcrafts, enchantments or sorceries, to the intent to get or find money or treasure, or to waste, consume or destroy any person in his body, members or goods, or to provoke any person to unlawful love, or for any other unlawful intent or purpose, or for despite of Christ, or for lucre of money, dig up or pull down any cross or crosses, or by such invocations or conjurations of spirits, witchcrafts, enchantments or sorcery, or any of them, take upon them to tell or declare where goods stolen or lost shall become. Contrary to this act, being thereof lawfully convict before such as shall have power and authority to hear and determine felonies, shall have and suffer such pains of death.
A felony punishable by death, hanging, not burning. Serious enough, though not quite as draconian as the Inquisition, but there were few instances of convictions.
In 1542, Henry VIII passed the first Witchcraft Act, which provided for witches to be tried and punished by the state. The Statute of 1542 made a felony of spirit conjuring, divining, and the casting of false or malicious spells and enchantments. Such offences were punishable by death, loss, and forfeiture of their lands, tenants, goods, and chattels. Records exist of only one case brought to trial under the law. The accused was pardoned. The law was repealed in 1547 by Edward VI.
That isn't to say the statute wasn't invoked for political expediency. It has been suggested that the king himself invoked it against his wife Anne Boleyn. A curious, possibly apocryphal, witch-related incident of the time tells of Lord Thomas Cromwell, 1st Earl of Essex, Chief Minister to King Henry VIII and distant relation to Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector, who was meant to have sought out Mother Shipton, a famous witch and prophetess, to determine his future. Mother Shipton, born Ursula Sonthiel, warned him, according to some, that "the time will come, my lord, when you shall be as low as I am, and that is low indeed." Cromwell was later arraigned for the crime of heresy, among a litany of other criminal accusations, and executed. Witchcraft trials up to the reign of George II were generally considered to have originated from the bottom up, mainly rooted in parochial disputes, the kind of which would flare up from time to time. The witchcraft statute provided the opportunity for legal redress in a culture that still functioned according to the kind of traditions described in James Fraser's Compendium of Pagan Folklore, The Golden Bough. Timeless traditions woven into the social fabric of daily folk life, despite the weighty influence of the Church. The practices of cunning folk, white witches, were relied upon for day-to-day human needs: medicine, midwifery, abortions, the treatment of sickly livestock, locating lost or stolen property, divination, marital guidance, and countermeasures against the malign spells, curses, and black magic of witches, from whom they were careful to dissociate themselves. Although it is easy to imagine, the distinction wasn't always clear. The roles of each group were presented as morally unambiguous black or white, a habit sharpened by an ecclesiastical worldview with its strict Manichaean sense of ethical duality. Fraudulent practitioners were always problematic, though. Dissatisfaction with results, suspicion, fear, and so on would probably have obscured the distinction. The law was generally tolerant toward cunning folk, but they could still fall afoul of it. The law was also keen to usurp the employment of witches as agents of retribution, a common demand for one who is wronged and with no obvious recourse to a fair judiciary. Not so much natural law as supernatural law.
Wage war against us if you are many, and cast a spell upon us if you are few.
And who's to say that a profitable racket couldn't have been sustained through the malicious casting of spells that would necessitate the purchase of counterspells and lucky charms, apotropaic magic. Later on, so-called men of the cloth, wanting a piece of the action, cut in with a far more grandiose operation. Chaucer had a keen eye for just such medieval mischief, as epitomized by the pardoner in the Canterbury Tales, an exceptionally low character who cheerily regales his travelling companions with a confession of his own, that he only makes a pretense of his holiness with fake relics. He gravely warns his congregation of the evils of avarice and hears their confession before promptly relieving them of their guilty sin and, of course, their money. Everyone's a winner.
Neighbours from Hell.
Alan McFarlane, an anthropologist, historian and foremost authority on witchcraft, unearthed old assizes records and other contemporary writings that suggested that incidences of witchcraft persecution, when they occurred, often blew up out of uncharitable inaction toward a neighbour in need. Not loaning a farm implement, selling a pig or leasing out pasture are some examples of the kind of mean-spiritedness that could trigger a chain of events, sometimes with fatal consequences.
Thus, it begins to seem as if it was those who offended against the ideals of a cooperative society by refusing to help their neighbours who found themselves bewitched.
The rationale behind the phenomenon of witchcraft seemed a matter of tracing an affliction or calamity to an historical incident. Perhaps someone had demonstrated a lack of cooperation with a neighbour regarding a favour, therefore this neighbour, usually a woman of a certain age, must have retaliated with a hex of some type. Often widowed women struggling to make ends meet would resort to outright begging rather than appealing for favour. Because the Church so influenced the commoner's sense of causality, any personal or family affliction, sickly livestock or other misfortune could be attributed to a moral failure, including not living up to the tenet of loving thy neighbor, which would have put an end to the matter, and any punishment stoically accepted. But what if an individual couldn't accept that such a misfortune was ultimately down to their own personal failings, and that the consequences were, therefore, nothing but God's divine will? What if he'd rather view his wretched luck as the work of the devil, whose agent the pestering neighbor must surely be? Either way, this entrenched dichotomy had the advantage of deflecting the resentment born of daily hardship and adversity away from the landed gentry and their clergy, safely discharging it by means of a scapegoat whenever necessary. The pesky old crone, the gypsy, the hare-lipped, the squint-eyed, or the hunchback could conveniently be made the target of local discontent. Suffice to say, the rulers needed their witches. So on the one hand, we have the Church psychologically browbeating the commoner into adopting a communal ideal and sharpening his conscience to that effect, dumping the burden of guilt firmly upon those who fail to achieve the high standards of good Christian charity. In other words, making you feel guilty for their sins. Failing this, we have the same Church condemning to death the neighborhood witch, basically exterminating the nuisance if the villagers turn against her in sufficient number for whatever reasons, be they superstitious fear, vendetta, or vulgar opportunism, but most probably when times were at their toughest. It was nothing if not a rather dreadful method of pest control. An Essex writer of the era, Thomas Addy, described it thus in 1656.
God hath given it as a strict command to all men to relieve the poor. Quoting Leviticus, Whosoever hearkeneth not to all the commandments of the Lord to do them, whereof relieving the poor is one, the Lord will send several crosses and afflictions and diseases upon them, as followeth in the chapter, and therefore men should look into the Scriptures, and search what sins bring afflictions from God's hand, and not say presently, What old man or woman was last at my door, that I may hang him or her for a witch? Yea, we should rather say, Because I did not relieve such a poor body that was lately at my door, but gave him harsh and bitter words, therefore God hath laid his affliction upon me. For God saith, Exodus, chapter 22, verse 23, If thou any way afflict widows and fatherless, and they at all cry unto me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath shall wax hot against thee.
Widowed women were often viewed with a mixture of suspicion and guilt. They could find themselves socially marginalized, almost feral to onlookers, perhaps milking the conscience of the neighborhood, admonishing the stingy, and warning of the spiritual consequences of an uncharitable attitude. India had a particularly severe solution with what to do with the burdensome, whose existence gnawed away at the conscience of society. Cremate them with the deceased husband on the funeral pyre in a ritualistic act of immolation known as sati. Ironically, Europe could take a somewhat similar stance, albeit through a more tortuous legal route. When interacting with the nomadic native tribes in their colonization of Pennsylvania, the Quakers discovered that these aboriginals had the custom of simply abandoning their old women to the elements once they had passed being useful.
Old women were no problem. If they no longer had someone to look after them, they were just abandoned in the forest. There was just a little plaintive wailing for a while, and then silence.
This may have seemed shocking to Quaker sensibilities, unlike other Europeans who deep down shared with some non-Europeans a universal physiological disgust toward worthless old women. An Elizabethan gentleman of means by the name of Reginald Scott wrote a rousing skeptical polemic damning the absurd cruelty of the inquisitors and witchmongers.
What unnatural and uncivil discourtesy, what cankered and spiteful malice, what outrageous and barbarous cruelty, what abominable and devilish inventions, and what flat and plain knavery is practised against these old women. I will set down the whole order of the Inquisition to the everlasting, inexcusable, and apparent shame of all witchmongers."
King James VI later responded with his demonology and had Scott's books incinerated. Although the Act of 1542 was repealed by Henry VIII's heir, Edward VI, in 1547, it was reinstated in more anodyne form in 1562 during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I as an Act against conjurations, enchantments and witchcrafts. The new Act still took the potential for sorcery-related acts of petty treason very seriously and reflected those concerns. The Protestant monarch, however, conspicuously sought the advice of Dr. John Dee, a somewhat Faustian character who assumed the Merlin-esque role of court wizard in matters both worldly and esoteric, notably answering a commission to determine astrologically an auspicious date for the royal coronation. It seems there was room within the statute for particular occult practices and some latitude available for Dee, whose more orthodox studies in various disciplines, mathematics, astronomy, navigation, geometry, cartography, and espionage, were considered of significant use to the realm. Dee's peculiar skill set was highly valued by Her Majesty and the royal coterie, and the revised Act was quite accommodating. Elizabeth Tudor acted as his financier. She became his fondest student, and he became her noble intelligencer. Dee even outlined a plan regarding the potential for a British Empire, but his arcane interests extended well beyond the scientific, leaning toward the esoteric and most infamously into necromancy. Severely testing the law, he may well have conducted his experiments in this area abroad and contravening the sacred principles of Christendom. Astrology and alchemy seem to have slipped in and out of favor, rather like John Dee himself during his long career. Meanwhile, unorthodox Britain, untrammeled by the stricter diktats of the old order, shifted into uncharted territory, defeating the Armada and setting a course to global supremacy.